dealing with these issues of reaching climate targets, I'm convinced in transport that we need all three pillars. We need to think of how we can reduce transport demand. We need to think about shifting road transport to rail, and shifting also car use towards light electric vehicles. I think this is a really important thing, and that comes from our heart and the team, really, that we need to do more, because renewable energy will not be cheap in the future, and these vehicles will help to use this renewable energy, which is scarce, to use it effectively, and we have a very energy efficient way of doing transport. So we are mainly guided by our Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Target, I think it's called, since a few months, and I come to the point of our little history about doing that. Myself, I have the honor to be acting as a scientific representative to the IEA, the International Energy Agency's Technology Collaboration Program on hybrid and electric vehicles, where we had a couple of years ago started this task about small electric vehicles, so international activity, also with South Korea, Switzerland, Belgium involved. You might have a look at the Small Electric Vehicles book. It's an open access book you can download, you can read, where we had also an international perspective with invited authors. It's already downloaded 25,000 times. And we did also studies which are with a more local aspect on electric small and light vehicles, for instance, in the south of Germany, where I come from. We also do technical research on light vehicles, which is here a picture of our Safe Light regional vehicle, where we try to have new concepts of building these cars in a cheap way, in a very safe way. So this is an L7E vehicle, which fulfills the ambition of an M1 car from the safety perspectives. So I think this was already my little introduction. I want to introduce the team. There is Mascha with a background in engineering, and she did the project coordination. There is Simone on the right side. She's an expert in ecologists. She's an ecologist, 20 years of experience of life cycle assessment. In the team was also Laura. She couldn't be with us today due to other obligations, but there is Mirko Goletz from the Institute of Transport Research, who is an expert in the transport demand. And Isheka helped with the doing, and Robert also he's a designer, he helped with doing the visualization. So that was the team. And I want to take the opportunity to thank again Annick for hosting us here today, and the members of LEVA-EU who made this possible. Thank you. So I hand over, Mascha.
So good morning to everyone also from my side. We are indeed happy having the opportunity to present our study today, which is the potential of light electric vehicles for climate protection through substitution of passenger car trips. And we took Germany as a case study. I will start with introducing light electric vehicles. I will explain the scope and the approach to our study, and then I hand over to my colleague Mirko Goletz, who will explain the trip substitution potential, and Simone Ehrenberger, who will show the emission reduction potential. Afterwards, I will conclude with a summary. We would like to kindly ask you to wait with questions of understanding until the end of the presentation. We will have enough time then, and happy to answer the questions afterwards. In a nutshell, we have investigated to what extent light electric vehicles could contribute to climate protection by replacing passenger car trips. When we started the study, we had a look at the situation of greenhouse gas emissions from the German transport sector. You can see it here on the left side, the composition of these emissions. Transport in Germany makes up around 20% of the greenhouse gas emissions. That means it's one of the most important emitters. From these emissions, almost 2/3 originate from passenger car trips, which you can see here marked in red. That means this share is considerable and thus also offers considerable potential for reductions. Reductions could be made, like Stephan Schmid also already mentioned, by avoiding trips or by shifting trips to other more sustainable means of transport, like light electric vehicles, or by improving the cars that we use. And the latter one is currently happening by electrifying the drivetrain. So one could ask, if we already electrify the drivetrain, do we really need to go beyond that for climate protection and include other possibilities like light electric vehicles? And the answer is yes, because even though electric cars emit fewer greenhouse gas emissions than those with internal combustion engine, and even if we could use 100% renewable energy, which we cannot today, then we still would have ecological impacts which we need to minimize. For example, due to mining of critical raw materials, which we need for generation, transmission, and storage of electrical energy. So we still need also with renewable energy to minimize consumption and to maximize the efficiency. And that means we need to go beyond a mere substitution of the technology of the drivetrain. But doing that means we need profound changes to make mobility sustainable, which is challenging. But on the other hand, if we miss climate protection targets, the changes will also be profound. Before we come to the study itself, I would like to introduce light electric vehicles once more here with the slide. We brought some pictures to give you an impression. The term light electric vehicles, or LEVs as it is abbreviated, covers a wide range of vehicles. We start with the smallest vehicle we have here, that's the e-scooter, which you can see on the left side. Then we have electric bikes, which saw a huge success in the last years. Same as cargo bikes, which you see more in the middle here. We have electric mopeds and motorcycles, and then we have something we call micro cars here on the right side of 4 examples. So you can see there are models with and without a cabin. We have vehicles with no 1, 2, or also more seats, and also the speeds vary. We have vehicles that can go up or over 100 kilometers per hour. For example, this red Nobi car, what you can see here, will be able to drive up to 128 kilometers per hour. The vehicles you see here are mostly on the market or will be available soon on the market. That means also LEVs would be a solution that is available today, also very important for climate protection. So why are LEVs worth evaluating their potential? First, they are lightweight, as the name already suggests. And if you take, for example, a microcar, a typical one with 4 wheels, that has a weight of around 500 kilograms in comparison with an average new car that was in 2020 in Germany, we had around 1,600 kilograms an average per car. So that's over 3 times more weight to move more or less the same number of persons in average, of course. And the heavier the car, the more energy is needed to move the car itself. But actually, we want to move passengers or goods. So the lighter the vehicle, the more efficient the vehicle. And you can see that also on the right side here with the chart. We compared 3 different categories: an electric bike, a microcar, and battery electric cars. And the blue bars indicate the amount of energy that you need for driving 100 kilometers. As we have very different vehicles in each category, we show here a range for each category. And if you compare that, you clearly see you need a lot less energy for the LEVs. And if you need less energy, of course, you need to produce also less energy, which is symbolized here with these wind power plants. Another aspect of reducing the need for energy for moving the car is that we can use smaller batteries. This is very important because of the critical raw materials you need for batteries, and also because of the greenhouse gas emissions that are connected to the production of batteries. And here again, we compare 3 different categories for the vehicles, again, e-bike, microcar, and battery electric car. And you can see that the emissions for battery production are proportional to the size and capacity of the batteries. Another aspect of the LEVs, which we didn't focus in the study, but is still important and we would like to mention, is the small footprint, which you can see on the right side. And that means space could be liberated, which is especially valuable in city centers, for example. So despite their positive properties, LEVs still lead a niche existence on the market, in research, and also on the political agenda. So we wanted to evaluate the potential of LEVs in order to see if it's worth promoting LEVs and to what extent the potential could help to contribute to climate protection. So the questions were, to what extent might LEVs substitute car trips, and related to this, how much CO2 equivalents might be saved with them? I will now explain the approach, how we investigated these research questions. Here you see the whole process at one glance. I will go through it step by step, but only very shortly as an overview, and details will follow with my colleagues. So first, we defined an exemplary set of different LEV categories, and we also defined a set for analysis criteria for the trip substitution. Then, based on a representative national travel survey, on an average day in Germany, we analyzed which car trips could be substituted with which kind of LEVs. Most of the car trips could be substituted by several LEV categories, for example, by a moped or a microcar. Then after this analysis, we knew how many trips could be substituted, and related to this, how much vehicle mileage also could be substituted. The mileage, or the kilometers, are important because they relate to the emissions. So I come to the second row here, the emission calculation. Here we started with a determination of the CO2 equivalent emissions for different LEV categories and also for cars with different types of propulsion technology. And then for each substitutable trip, we chose the one LEV with the lowest emission. Then for each trip, we calculated the difference between the emissions which would result from the car trip compared to the emissions from the chosen LEV for that trip. And then the last step was to aggregate the saved emissions for all trips. And as we did it for an average day in Germany, we scaled it up for 1 year. We would like to point out that in this study, we did not investigate changes in mobility behavior or social acceptance issue or political measures that would be subject to further studies. You can see here the 9 categories that we used for our analysis. We have an e-scooter, an electric bike with a maximum speed of 25 kilometers per hour, something we call an e-bike plus, which allows for cargo or transport of up to 3 children. Then we have the speed pedelec with a maximum design speed of 45 kilometers per hour, a moped with the same speed, a motorcycle, which in our case for the study can go up to 120 kilometers per hour. And then we have 3 types of microcars differing in speed. We have one with 45 kilometers per hour and 90 kilometers per hour. They belong to categories L6E and L7E and are limited by these categories by the regulation number 168/2013 that Annick just mentioned in the beginning. And then we have another one which has 3 wheels and therefore belongs to category L5E, which is not limited in speed by regulation, and we chose an exemplary model with 125 kilometers per hour. So for each of these categories, we chose an exemplary vehicle that is already or soon on the market, and we used the technical parameters from these LEVs for our analysis, both for trip substitution and also for the emission calculation. Yeah, and then I hand over to my colleague, Mirko Goletz, who will explain the trip substitution potential.
Oh, great.
Kannst du vielleicht einfach davon?
Kannst du das mal wieder festmachen? Sorry, I lost my microphone. I'll just put it here. Yeah. Thank you, Mascha. I'm going to talk about the trip substitution potential, which has just been explained, but I'm going to go a bit more into detail in the next couple of slides what that means. So by trip substitution potential, we understand the amount of trips of cars that could theoretically be replaced by LEVs, meaning that each trip that is currently carried out by a car that can be carried out by an LEV counts as a potential. So just keep in mind that this is sort of an upper boundary that doesn't probably reflect on personal preferences, but more on the characteristics of the trips. So to derive this trip substitution potential, we use the German National Travel Household Survey, which is called MID, in its most recent form from 2017. And MID contains information about almost 1 million trips by 315,000 people and from 150,000 households. And MID not only contains trip information, but it also includes socioeconomic information. So we can not only match the characteristics of trips with the LEVs, but also the socioeconomic information. And so by doing so, we can derive a good picture of the day-to-day mobility in Germany on a representative day, and then derive the substitution potential. Next slide. Oh, here we go. So what are the characteristics of today's car trips in Germany? Firstly, saying the car is still the most dominant form of transport in Germany. About 57% of all trips are currently carried out by a car in Germany on an average day. Cars are sparsely occupied. The average occupancy rate is just 1.4 people per car, despite many cars have space for about 4 to 5 people. And many trips are, despite this fact, are really short, so 80% of all car trips are below 20 kilometers, and 98% of all car trips are even below 100 kilometers. And so how did we derive the trip substitution potential then? Well, what we did was we made a trip-by-trip comparison with all LEVs on a day-by-day basis and defined criteria that the LEVs matched, and then looked whether these criteria could be suitable to replace a trip by an LEV. So here we see a set of criteria such as trip length, the trip purpose, the age of the driver, the weather, if there are impairments for the person, and the number of persons for their trip. And then we looked whether these criteria could make a replacement possible. Just to give you an example here, an exemplary trip that is 8 kilometers long has been a commuting trip and has been carried out by a 59-year-old driver on a day where there was snowfall and the person didn't have any impairments and traveled on his own. We checked whether this trip could have been carried out by an e-bike plus. And then going through all these different criteria, we could see, for instance, that, well, lengthwise it was possible, from the purpose point it was possible, from the age of the driver it was possible. In that example here, it wouldn't have been possible to replace it by an e-bike because we excluded snowy days to be replaced by two-wheelers, and so on and so forth. And so we did this for all of the 960,000 trips that were made by car, and for all of the LEVs that we included in the study. And here we come to the results. Firstly, I'm going to go through the left side where we see the trip substitution potential, which means we only looked on the trip base, not on the mileage base.
And we see that e-scooters, for instance, would have been able to replace 6% of current car trips based on the characteristics that I just introduced. And then the more we advance with bigger or larger vehicles that have like a higher range and higher seating capacity, we could see that about 76% of all trips would have been able to be replaced by LEVs. And on the right-hand side, looking on the mileage, the picture is a bit different. So the mileage is a bit lower than the trips because we have less lengthy trips, and some of the lengthy trips couldn't be replaced by LEVs, for instance, due to the range limit. But still, about 50% of the mileage of currently undertaken car trips could be replaced by LEVs, which shows us that, well, there is a quite huge potential to replace trips and also to reduce mileage by LEVs. And yeah, that was it from the trip substitution. I would like to hand over to Simone. Take my microphone.
So from these trips that we identified, we calculated how much emission could be actually saved. And we took into consideration not only the emissions that take place during vehicle operation, but we also included the production of the vehicles and also the production of fuel or electricity that you actually need for operating the vehicles. So we did that both for the light electric vehicles and for the passenger cars we wanted to replace. In our study and calculations, we are referring to the year 2030, so we assumed a German passenger car for the year 2030, which already contains a higher number of battery electric vehicles than compared to what we are seeing today. And of course, this also affects electricity mix that you use for your vehicle operation. So when we calculate all this together, the emissions of greenhouse gas emission on a per kilometer basis are very different, of course, from light electric vehicles and passenger cars. So the difference is in weight of the vehicles. Also between the single electric vehicles, of course, the weight is very different. The battery size is different, and also the energy consumption for vehicle operation is very different from vehicle to vehicle. And if you consider the trips we substitute and take the average of the LEVs and consider the passenger cars, like an average passenger car of that year 2030, then you only have 12% of the greenhouse gas emissions in total compared to the passenger cars. And of course, what is even more severe for the passenger cars, that you have quite a few vehicles left in the market, also in the future market, that are operated with fossil fuels, which also generates, of course, emissions during vehicle operation. So this is a huge difference compared to the light electric vehicles that we assume are suitable for substituting a lot of trips. So if we take this all together, for every trip we identified, we find that we can reduce 44% of the emissions on these trips. So if you drive by car, you have on these trips more than or around 130 million tons per year. And you can reduce this number by 44% when you substitute these trips with light electric vehicles. Of course, we took always, as Mascha explained, the most suitable light electric vehicle, and then we took the most CO2 or greenhouse gas efficient vehicle. So this is kind of the maximum potential that we find can be realized in the German market or transport system. And most of these reduction potential comes from the smaller light electric vehicles, and then there's still a huge potential where you really would need or would replace trips with microcars and with motorcycles. And we calculated that for an average day in Germany, And if we assume that this day happens throughout the year, so we can save actually 57 million tons of CO2 in total in Germany. And if you think of, okay, we have transport emission of 146 million tons in Germany in the year 2020, so this is quite considerable. Of course, you cannot compare it directly because we also included in this number the vehicle production and fuel production. So this is not only referring to the transport sector as such. And what we conclude from these calculations will be presented by Mascha again.
Yeah, thank you. I will repeat some of the numbers Simone just explained. We found in total that up to 44% less CO2 equivalents could be emitted in theory by replacing 3/4 of the German car trips, which is really considerable. And we would then also replace half of the kilometers that are currently driven in Germany. That would save 57 million tons CO2 equivalents per year. And on average, if we just take the trips substituted by LEVs, we have this 88% of the emissions that could be saved. That corresponds to the 12% the emissions of LEVs compared to passenger cars that Simone just explained. And these figures are sufficiently high to suggest that further research into LEV is worth pursuing. Again, we would like to point out that we did not take into account social, political, or LEV acceptance aspects. This is also important for further steps, of course, and that should be then subject of other studies. If we have a look at the result, 75% trip substitution potential might seem high at the first glance. But if you consider that 80% of the car trips are shorter than 20 kilometers already, then the result seems plausible. If you would like to discover more scenarios for this calculation of emissions, you could also use an interactive online tool which will be available in the internet. You can also contact us if you have questions. It is clear that to realize this potential, even in parts, would require profound changes, and these changes then would have to encourage a switch away from the long-standing habit of using passenger cars, and we assume it probably must include push and pull measures. Yeah, as a last remark, we would like to say that LEVs, of course, are not a standalone solution, but they must work together with other means of transport, together with public transport, using trains, using also cars for long trips, for example. So we really need a mixture, also according to the approach to avoid trips, to shift trips to more sustainable options, and to improve the vehicles. So as a conclusion, we found that the potential of the LEVs to support climate change mitigation is really significant, and we think this promise suggests that further investigation is urgently called for. Then you would also have to investigate social, ecological, economic, safety and planning implications, and examples for research questions would be what kind of specific changes are necessary to realize some part of the potential that we found with our study, how can you adapt transport systems and also the vehicles to be designed to maximize the safety of LEVs, and then also other aspects like what would urban planning would have for options if LEVs would be extensively used. And also, how can adoption of LEVs be accelerated, as we have to act fast in order to protect the climate. So we see that without fundamental changes in many fields, the LEV potential will not be extensively realized. So there's a lot of work to do, but the potential also is really promising. Thank you very much, and then we are happy to answer questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Mascha and the DLR team. So we've got a few minutes now for any questions of fact about the research. If anyone has any overhanging issues that they don't, please, sir. You have to speak. Oh, there's a microphone.
Sorry. Sorry, disengaging mask and so on. The factor about take-up. Do you have some further comments about LEV safety to make? Because one of the things that I could see is that in terms of take-up, by comparison with the ordinary passenger car, a criteria that the ordinary consumer would have would be, well, I'm on my LEV, and the other vehicles are vans and trucks, and how safe am I going to be? So if you have any other information on that subject.
I answer.
Do you want to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a complex question, and there would be a long answer. I will make it short now because we still have this panel discussion and also the question and answer session. First, there are two aspects of safety. First, the safety of the people within the cars and also of the people outside the cars, of course. Both has to be considered. And then to increase the safety of people in and outside the cars, on the one hand, you have to improve the safety of LEVs, and that would be very different for the different categories, because obviously for an electric bike, you have other options than for a microcar, for example. And the other hand, which is maybe even more important, is on regulation and infrastructure side. You have to organize space and use of LEVs in a way that it maximizes safety.
There was another question, I think. Madam?
Good morning, thank you. In your equation, did you consider the state of the roads and if there's a slope or a downwards road or an upwards road and the wearing out of tires? Did you consider the tire aspect, tires, and the engine getting weary and bumpy roads and things like that in your equation, because you calculated 8 kilometers, for example, or 20 kilometers against 20 kilometers, but you don't know the state of the roads to make it a general equation. Or did you take an average? Or, well, thank you very much for your answer.
So
if that relates to the trip substitution potential. Because we looked on car trips and thought, well, could they be replaced by LEVs? We can assume that the road conditions of the car trips, like the car trips take place in Germany, usually are quite good. So I don't see really a problem replacing such a trip by a microcar. There could be some conditions where this isn't possible. Then topography, hilly and steepy, that is an advantage of LEVs generally over, for instance, bicycles. So I don't think there will be really a problem related to this for the LEV itself, but it's going to reduce the range for sure. So it might have an impact on that. So that's a good remark. Maybe we have to look into this a bit further. But in general, I don't think it's going to really influence the amount of mileage in trips that can be replaced.
Maybe one short addition to this. When we evaluated the trip substitution potential, we did not take the technical electrical range for the vehicles, because this is usually quite large. For example, you have electric bikes with a range up to 120 kilometers, but still we would not say you can replace trips up to 100 kilometers with an electric bike in average. That would be more like a holiday or something. But we limited this range and we introduced something we call a relevant travel distance, which is much lower than the technical electrical range. So this would also take into account that you drive only, for example, with an electric bike, only 15 kilometers one way and per day 30 kilometers. So I think that somehow refers also to this question.
Any others in the room? Sir.
Yeah, last year, Trek Bicycle published also a study. Could you look at it and fact-check it?
Sorry.
Last year, Trek Bicycle, they published a story, also a study about carbon footprint of their bicycle from different range, and also, but it was a study in the US, and what if there were also changes that you propose in the US, and I wondered if you had the chance to fact-check this study.
Maybe I can answer to that. So for calculating the emissions, we took literature data. Well, not a specific study we were referring to, but of course we looked into literature, what is like the typical material composition of bicycles or microcars and so on. So we try to find a generic material composition of every type of vehicle, and then also that applies for battery size and other factors, so energy consumption, for example. So we didn't take into account only one study. We looked on literature in general, also referring, for example, to lifetime mileage, which is another important factor, where there is not a lot of statistic data available. But of course, if we find studies for the US, we took into consideration what was assumed there for lifetime mileage, for example, or CO2 emissions. But basically, we did our own production model for calculating the CO2 emissions bottom up.
But I think the question was if you could have a look at the study. Yes, we can. If you send it to us, we can have a look, a quick look how it compares.
Yeah, because this was a study from a bicycle company, so we take it as not as independent as yours.
Yeah, usually it's not everything is open and written, but we can have a look. So please come back to me. And
that Trek study they actually engaged in external consultants. I know that study, and it's just one amongst many. This study took account of lots of literature. There are many accounts of life cycle emissions for electric bikes, and DLR looked more widely.
Yeah, and you always have to think of life cycle assessment as an estimation of emissions, and actually in reality there is a range. Like vehicle A has other production emissions than vehicle B and so on, so it would never be like only one figure.
Okay, anyone else is on this end here?
Thank you. So you mentioned several times the social uptake, and you said more research would be needed. So could you nevertheless try and give a couple of comments, preliminary comments, going beyond the general statement that we need profound changes everywhere? What are those social obstacles and how they could be overcome? Just some ideas into this.
I'm sure Mascha and colleagues will say something to that, but I would just remind everybody that we've got a discussion with politicians now, and then after lunch, a long discussion with scientists that include behaviour change experts. So your question will be answered at greater length there.
Yeah.
If you have anything to add?
Yeah, should we postpone this to this panel discussion?
I think that would be sensible, if that's all right, if you're staying around. We will be going into that in detail, I'm sure. Any other questions in the room? At the back there, gentleman.
Good morning. Have you got into account the autonomous cars? So, also your research is on the center of the city or the suburbs also? Because when you have autonomous cars, we have sensors everywhere, and of course the streets are okay. So, did you count this thing? Thank you.
Maybe I start with the autonomous cars and you add with the regions. We did here not take into account autonomous cars. Assistance systems from autonomous driving could also help LEVs, for example, in the safety issue, but in this study we did not take this into account.
Just adding on the regional aspect, if you stay for the afternoon, we're going to have a slide on the composition of trips that can be replaced on different regions. Generally, this substitution potential is just for all of Germany, so there's there's an overall value. We can narrow it down or just have it spatially more disintegrated. Principally, there's more mileage that can be replaced in suburban areas and rural areas because just simply more mileage takes place there, whereas in the cities there are more trips that have like a short length and can also be replaced.
Okay. One more here. Microphone. Oh, no.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation and the very, very interesting results. I do have a question, though, that this is based on the assumption that the principle of unbundling the car trips in different kind of vehicles and light electric vehicles is based on the assumption that each household has at its disposal a range of vehicles. So I was wondering if a specific analysis of the potential of the shared model versus the ownership model has been made and how much of a potential it is, because I think a range of vehicles is quite a reach for a majority of people. And I was wondering if you had studied or considered this question.
Yeah. That's a very interesting question indeed, and we did not cover this with our study, but that would be interesting for further studies. And as Simone already mentioned, we said we analyzed kind of a scenario for 2030 where we also assumed that you would have more sharing schemes and so on. And so we did not analyze per household if LEVs could substitute all trips from one household in 1 year, but per trip. And then other means of transport would need to be added, like taking trains for longer trips or cars, and all in sharing schemes, as you mentioned.
And I'm sure, again, we'll come back to that question of unbundling in the other discussions. That's surely fundamental. So I'd like to now thank our DLR colleagues for their presentation, and they will sit back down and we'll let the political panel now take the place. Thank you. So if our new panel can come and sit up. Huh? Yes, if Mascha will stay. So now we have we? Oh, sorry, no. Mascha will remain available for any questions of science, just 2 meters from us here.
Here, to be honest.
No. So we have Marion Jean Marinescu, MEP, who's joining us late and virtually. He had to postpone a little. Michael Kyriakopoulos, who is a senior expert from the EU.